In December 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood on the beaches of northern France and felt the cold Atlantic wind against his face. He had been sent by Hitler to inspect the Atlantic Wall, the vast network of fortifications that was supposed to stop the Allied invasion. What he found horrified him. The defenses were a disaster. Bunkers were incomplete. Minefields were sparse. Artillery positions were poorly placed. The troops manning the positions were second-rate units, many of them recovering from wounds or too old for frontline combat. Rommel turned to his aide and said something that would prove prophetic. He said that if the Allies landed here, they would break through within days. The Atlantic Wall was a fantasy. It existed on paper, but not in reality. For the next 6 months, Rommel would fight desperately to fix these defenses. He would argue with Hitler, clash with fellow generals, and work himself to exhaustion trying to prepare for the invasion he knew was coming. And when D-Day finally arrived, everything happened exactly as Rommel had predicted. The question is why no one listened to him. Erwin Rommel was not supposed to be in France at all. His fame had been built in North Africa, where he commanded the legendary Afrika Korps. He had earned the nickname the Desert Fox for his cunning tactics and aggressive style. Even his enemies respected him. Winston Churchill once said that Rommel was a great general, even if he was fighting on the wrong side. But by 1943, the African campaign was over. Rommel had been evacuated before the final surrender, saved by Hitler to fight another day. He spent months recovering from illness and exhaustion, watching from the sidelines as the war turned against Germany. Then in November 1943, Hitler summoned Rommel and gave him a new assignment. He would inspect the Atlantic Wall and assess its readiness to repel the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. Rommel accepted the mission, but he had no idea what he was walking into. The Atlantic Wall was one of the greatest propaganda achievements of the Nazi regime. German newsreels showed massive concrete bunkers, bristling with artillery. They showed beaches covered with obstacles and mines. They showed confident soldiers ready to throw any invader back into the sea. The reality was very different. When Rommel began his inspection tour in December 1943, he discovered that most of the fortifications existed only on maps. Bunkers that were supposed to be complete were still under construction. Artillery pieces were missing. Ammunition stocks were dangerously low. The troops were even more concerning. Many of the divisions defending France were static divisions, units without vehicles or heavy weapons, incapable of mobile warfare. They were filled with older soldiers, wounded veterans, and men with medical conditions that made them unfit for combat in the East. Rommel inspected position after position and found the same problems everywhere. The defenses were too thin, the reserves were too far from the coast. The entire strategy was based on assumptions that Rommel believed were fatally flawed. He sat down and wrote a detailed report for Hitler. His conclusions were blunt. The Atlantic Wall could not stop a determined Allied assault. Fundamental changes were needed, and they were needed immediately. But changing the strategy meant challenging the men who had created it, and that meant challenging some of the most powerful figures in the German military. The German defensive strategy in France was based on a simple idea. The Atlantic Wall would slow down any Allied landing. Then powerful panzer reserves, held far behind the lines, would counterattack and drive the Allies back into the sea. This strategy had been developed by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme commander of German forces in the West. Rundstedt was an old-school Prussian aristocrat who believed in the traditional principles of mobile warfare. He wanted to keep his armored divisions far from the beaches, where they would be safe from Allied naval guns and aircraft. When the Allies landed, he would identify their main thrust and then concentrate his panzers for a decisive counterattack. Rommel thought this strategy was insane. He had fought the Allies in North Africa. He had experienced their overwhelming air superiority firsthand. He knew what happened to armored columns that tried to move during daylight hours when Allied aircraft controlled the skies. They were destroyed. Rommel argued that any panzer division that tried to move toward the beaches after the invasion began would be caught in the open and annihilated from the air. The counterattack would never arrive. The reserves that Rundstedt was counting on would be burning wrecks along the roads of Normandy. The only way to defeat the invasion, Rommel insisted, was to stop it on the beaches. The panzers had to be positioned close to the coast, ready to attack the Allied forces while they were still vulnerable, before they could establish a secure beachhead. The first 24 hours would be decisive. If the Germans could throw the Allies back into the sea on the first day, the invasion would fail. If the Allies were allowed to establish themselves on shore, Germany would lose the war. Rommel used a phrase that would become famous. He called the day of the invasion the longest day. He said it would be the longest day for both sides, and whoever won that day would win the war. Rundstedt disagreed completely. He believed Rommel was overestimating Allied air power and underestimating German mobile capabilities. The two field marshals argued bitterly, each convinced that the other's strategy would lead to disaster. The dispute went all the way to Hitler. Hitler listened to both arguments and then made the worst possible decision. He compromised. Some panzer divisions would be positioned near the coast, as Rommel wanted. Others would be held in reserve far behind the lines, as Rundstedt wanted. And the reserve divisions could not be moved without Hitler's personal authorization. This meant that neither strategy could be properly implemented. The forces near the coast were too weak to stop the invasion alone. The forces in reserve were too far away to intervene quickly. And the requirement for Hitler's personal approval would create fatal delays when every hour counted. Rommel was furious, but he accepted the decision and focused on what he could control. If he could not have the panzers, he would make the beaches themselves into killing zones. For the next 6 months, Rommel drove himself and his men relentlessly. He toured the coastal defenses constantly, appearing at construction sites at all hours, demanding faster progress, threatening and cajoling officers who fell behind schedule. Under his supervision, millions of mines were laid along the beaches and in the fields behind them. Rommel personally designed obstacles to destroy landing craft, steel barriers, and wooden stakes that would rip open the bottoms of boats attempting to reach the shore. He ordered the flooding of low-lying areas behind the beaches to prevent airborne landings. He placed sharpened stakes in open fields where gliders might land. He turned every potential landing zone into a trap. The soldiers called these obstacles Rommel's asparagus. They sprouted from the ground all along the coast, thousands upon thousands of them, each one designed to kill Allied soldiers. But Rommel knew it was not enough. He was working against time, and time was running out. He estimated that he needed until the summer of 1944 to complete his defensive preparations. He hoped the Allies would wait that long. They did not. On the morning of June 5, 1944, Rommel made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He left his headquarters in France and drove to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to meet with Hitler about getting more panzer divisions moved closer to the coast. The weather forecast predicted storms over the English Channel for the next several days. Rommel believed the Allies would not risk a landing in bad weather. He thought he had time for a brief trip home. He was wrong. The Allies had found a brief window of acceptable weather. General Eisenhower made the decision to launch the invasion on June 6th. While Rommel was driving through Germany, the largest amphibious assault in history was crossing the English Channel. The first reports reached German headquarters in the early hours of June 6th. Paratroopers were landing in Normandy. Was this the real invasion or a diversion? The German commanders were paralyzed by uncertainty. Some believed this was the main attack. Others thought it was a feint, designed to draw reserves away from the real landing at Pas-de-Calais. And the one man who had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment was hundreds of miles away. Rommel received the news around 6 in the morning. He immediately got in his car and raced back to France. But the roads were long and the hours were precious. He would not reach his headquarters until late afternoon, by which time the battle had already been decided. The invasion unfolded exactly as Rommel had predicted. Allied forces landed on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. At some beaches, particularly Omaha, the defenders inflicted terrible casualties, but the German defenses were simply not strong enough to throw the attackers back into the sea. The panzer reserves that could have made the difference sat motionless behind the lines. Rundstedt requested permission to move them forward. The request went up the chain of command to Hitler's headquarters. But Hitler was asleep, and his staff was afraid to wake him. For hours, the most powerful armored units in France did nothing while Allied soldiers fought their way off the beaches. By the time Hitler finally woke and authorized the movement of the reserves, it was too late. Allied aircraft filled the skies over Normandy. Any German unit that tried to move was immediately attacked from the air. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, launched a counterattack in the afternoon. It was too little, too late. The division fought bravely, but could not break through to the beaches. By evening, the Allies had established a beachhead that would never be dislodged. Rommel arrived at his headquarters to find a disaster unfolding exactly as he had warned. The beaches had not held. The panzers had not arrived in time. The longest day was ending, and Germany had lost. Over the next several weeks, Rommel fought desperately to contain the Allied beachhead. He threw every available unit into the battle, trying to prevent a breakout that would doom German forces in France. But he knew the situation was hopeless. In private conversations with his staff, he spoke openly about the need to end the war. Germany could not win. Every day the fighting continued meant more German soldiers dying for nothing. These conversations were dangerous. Speaking of defeat was treason in Hitler's Germany, but Rommel no longer cared. He had seen too much death, and he knew more was coming. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied aircraft near the town of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The car crashed and Rommel was thrown onto the road. He suffered severe skull fractures and nearly died. While Rommel lay in a hospital bed recovering from his wounds, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler on July 20th. The bomb exploded but failed to kill the dictator. The conspirators were quickly arrested, and under torture, some of them named Rommel as a supporter of their plot. The evidence against Rommel was circumstantial. He had known some of the conspirators. He had spoken about the need to end the war. He had questioned Hitler's leadership. Whether he was actually part of the assassination plot remains debated by historians to this day. But Hitler was convinced of Rommel's guilt. The problem was what to do about it. Rommel was the most popular general in Germany. He was a national hero, admired by soldiers and civilians alike. Putting him on trial would be a propaganda disaster. The German people might learn that their beloved desert fox had turned against their leader. Hitler chose a different solution. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home with a message from Hitler. Rommel was accused of treason. He had 2 choices. He could face a trial before the People's Court, which would mean public disgrace and the arrest of his family. Or he could take poison and die a hero's death. His family would be protected. He would be given a state funeral with full military honors. Rommel understood what was being offered. He said goodbye to his wife and son, got into a car with the 2 generals, and drove a short distance away from his home. 15 minutes later, he was dead. The official announcement said that Field Marshal Rommel had died of wounds suffered in the July 17th air attack. Hitler sent condolences to the family. A state funeral was held with full military honors. The German people mourned their hero, never knowing the truth. Rommel was right about D-Day. He was right about the beaches. He was right about the panzers. He was right about the air power. He was right about the 24 hours that would decide everything. If his strategy had been fully implemented, the outcome might have been different. Historians still debate whether the invasion could have been stopped, but most agree that Rommel's approach gave Germany its best chance. Instead, the German High Command chose a compromise that guaranteed failure. They did not concentrate their forces on the beaches as Rommel wanted. They did not hold sufficient reserves for a decisive counterattack as Rundstedt wanted. They did the worst of both worlds. And then they compounded the error by requiring Hitler's personal approval to move the reserves. On the most important day of the war, the German military machine was paralyzed by its own command structure. Rommel saw all of this coming. He warned Hitler repeatedly. He fought with Rundstedt. He begged for more resources, more troops, more time. Nobody listened. The man who had earned his reputation as an aggressive, offensive commander spent his last campaign arguing for defensive preparations that were never completed. The desert fox who had chased the British across North Africa spent his final months digging trenches and laying mines. He knew what was coming. He knew the Allies would win the battle for the beaches. He knew Germany would lose the war, and he was right about all of it. The tragedy of Erwin Rommel is that being right was not enough. He saw the disaster coming and could not prevent it. He watched his predictions come true and then paid with his life for daring to be correct when his leaders were wrong. 6 months before D-Day, Rommel stood on those beaches and knew the Atlantic Wall would fail. He spent every day trying to change that outcome, and he failed. But it was not because he was wrong. It was because nobody listened. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. We uncover the untold stories of World War II, the ones that history books left out. See you in the next video.